Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was late summer when we stumbled upon the field. It wasn't marked on any map, and we didn't even know it existed until we took a wrong turn down an old, forgotten road. At first, it seemed like just another wide, empty expanse. Endless. Grass stretching toward the horizon, broken only by the occasional wildflower or gnarled tree. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the fields, but something about it felt wrong. We parked the car at the edge of the field, its old tires crunching lightly on gravel. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The moment we stepped out, a chill ran down my spine. The sky was a strange, muted shade of gray, clouded with no real reason. No storm clouds, just an unnatural haze. "Do you guys feel that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Mark replied, brushing his hair out of his face. "The air. It's thicker, somehow." I nodded, scanning the horizon. There were no signs of life beyond the endless grass. No birds, no movement. Just silence. We began walking, following a narrow path beaten into the grass by someone, or something, long ago. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. The whispering started faint, barely audible, as if the voices were coming from a distance. But they weren't far. They were just beyond the edge of hearing. Murmurs woven into the wind, no matter how still the air seemed. They spoke in soft, unnatural tones, as though they were not meant to be heard by human ears. "There's something wrong with this place," I said again, this time louder. The words felt hollow, swallowed by the strange quiet. Mark tried to reassure us. "It's just a field. We're overthinking it." But then the shadows started moving. They shifted in the tall grass, subtly at first, barely noticeable. But as we walked, those shadows grew darker, more pronounced. They seemed to flicker around our feet, then rise, swirling through the air in unnatural patterns. There were no clouds above, yet the sky dimmed with an unsettling quickness as if the field was swallowing the light. Emily clung to my arm, her breath shaky. "We need to turn back." "We can't," Mark said, his voice sharp. "It's a loop. We've been walking in circles." That's when I saw it. Something moving just beyond the reach of our sight. A figure, tall and pale, its limbs elongated unnaturally, distorted as it glided through the tall grass. It had no face, no features, only an empty, haunting silhouette. Like a void in human form. "Run!" I screamed. The field became alive with sound then. The whispering grew into screaming, an inhuman cacophony that filled the air with anguish and rage. The figure darted closer, its movements impossibly fast, like it was warping reality itself. I could feel its presence closing in on us, suffocating the very space between breaths. Mark tripped, falling to the ground, but before he could even cry out, the shadows enveloped him. His screams were swallowed into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but silence. We couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. The grass clawed at us, pulling at our limbs. It felt like the field was consuming us, swallowing us whole. Emily and I stumbled forward, our breaths ragged, tears streaming down our faces. Then, as suddenly as it began, the screaming stopped. The whispers faded into silence. The shadows melted away, leaving nothing but the field, calm, empty, and still. The darkness lifted, and the sky returned to its unnatural gray. We collapsed in exhaustion at the edge of the field, unable to speak. Our bodies ached, our minds fogged with dread. When we finally looked back, there was no sign of the figure, no trace of the terror that had chased us through the grass. But even now, I swear, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Just a few friends, a remote campsite deep in the forest, and nothing but the sound of nature. We had found a secluded spot near a pristine lake, surrounded by towering pines and an overwhelming silence. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the campsite as we settled in for the evening. Our campsite was basic: tents, a small fire pit, and a pile of firewood we had gathered earlier in the day. The air was crisp, the sky clear. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off from the very beginning. As we sat around the fire, the laughter started to fade. The forest wasn't as quiet as we'd thought. Every so often we would hear faint noises, footsteps just beyond the tree line, or low, unintelligible whispers carried on the wind. At first, we assumed it was just wildlife, maybe some distant hikers, or even the wind playing tricks. But the sounds never seemed far away. "Enough. It's probably just the forest settling down for the night," Jake said, though his voice trembled slightly. He glanced over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting something to step out of the trees. "Let's not let it ruin the night," Sarah chimed in. "It's fine. We're far from anyone else." Yet, as the fire burned lower, the forest became darker, too dark. The towering pines loomed closer, shadows twisting unnaturally. The occasional rustle of leaves was no longer just the sound of the breeze. It sounded deliberate, as though something was moving between the trees, watching. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, low and massive, slipping between the trees. I turned quickly, expecting to see one of my friends, but they were all still sitting by the fire, their attention focused on the flames. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "What?" Jake asked, his voice sharp with concern. "That thing." I pointed toward the edge of the clearing. But when we looked, the shadow was gone. Sarah shook her head. "It's just your imagination." The night went on, but the unease grew. We tried to stay focused, laughing and telling stories, but each conversation was punctuated by unnatural noises, the whispering growing louder, unintelligible and twisted. Every now and then, something seemed to move through the trees faster than any animal could. By midnight, the fire had nearly burned out. The small flames flickered weakly against the darkness. I could barely make out the faces of my friends anymore. The quiet was oppressive, filled with the constant rustling from beyond the campsite. "It's just a dream," Jake said, standing to throw another log onto the fire, though it was more out of a desperate attempt to dispel the growing dread. But the second the wood touched the flames, the fire hissed, smoke curling into the air with an unnatural force. The flames flickered, almost dancing in an erratic rhythm before fading once again into faint embers. The whispering grew louder, surrounding us from all directions. It wasn't words we could understand, just a continuous hum of voices that seemed to seep into our minds, clawing at our thoughts. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "No, we can't," Jake snapped back. "We're miles from the nearest trail. We'll get lost if we leave now." But as we argued, the shadows returned, closer this time. Tall figures, humanoid but grotesque, emerged from the trees, their forms warped by the darkness. Their features were indistinct, faces distorted into twisted masks of malice. Their eyes glowed a dim red, unblinking, locked onto us. One stepped into the clearing, its footsteps soft but deliberate. The ground beneath it seemed to tremble ever so slightly with each movement. We froze, unable to breathe, unable to speak. The figures didn't need words. They exuded a suffocating sense of malevolence. "We have to get to the car," I whispered, my voice barely audible. As we scrambled to our feet, the figures began closing in. The last remnants of the fire hissed out entirely, leaving us in utter darkness. We could hear their footsteps, slow and deliberate, closing the distance with every second. "Run!" Jake yelled. We bolted toward the edge of the forest, crashing through the trees, stumbling blindly through the underbrush. The whispers followed, becoming deafening, the sound of hundreds of voices overlapping, screaming, laughing, crying in anguish. Just as I broke free from the tree line, I turned back and saw it. A massive, twisted figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its shadow stretching impossibly long, its form a black void against the starlit sky. The last thing I saw before the forest swallowed me whole was its glowing eyes, piercing red, void of emotion, full of something dark and ancient. We never found the campsite again. It was a weekend trip meant for relaxation. My friends and I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, a cozy retreat far from the city's noise. The cabin was tucked away on a quiet, barely used trail, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sounds of nature. The first night passed peacefully with a warm fire crackling in the stone fireplace and laughter echoing softly through the wooden walls. But something wasn't quite right. As the days went by, a strange unease settled over the cabin. Every time we ventured outside, the woods seemed quieter, darker. The birds stopped singing, and the wind seemed to avoid our path altogether. We didn't realize how isolated we truly were until the third night. The cabin's only source of light was a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, and as night fell, shadows grew long and restless. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of silence. That night we went to bed early, each of us feeling the creeping weight of an invisible presence watching from the darkness. I awoke sometime after midnight, my body tense and my breath shallow. A soft, scraping sound came from outside the window, a sound too deliberate, too close. I listened carefully, heart thudding in my chest, but the noise stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I gently slid out of bed and moved to the window. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, its shadows swallowing the cabin in darkness. There was nothing unusual in sight, only trees, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the wind. Still, an oppressive weight pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I crawled back into bed, trying to dismiss the panic creeping through my veins. Just a sound, nothing more. But my friends weren't sleeping peacefully. I could hear soft whispers in the room, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to press against the walls. They weren't coming from any of us. "Stop," I whispered, shaking my friend's shoulder. "Wake up." She didn't move. The whispers grew louder, twisting into indistinct words I couldn't understand. I stumbled out of bed, rushing to wake the others, but they all appeared frozen in place, their faces pale, eyes wide open but unblinking, as though they were lost in something beyond consciousness. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. I had to get them out, away from whatever was happening. But when I twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. I screamed, desperately pulling at it, my hands going numb with cold. Behind me, the whispers turned into screams, horrific, inhuman cries, spilling into the room like a tide of agony. I spun back around, only to see them. Faces pressed against the windows, noses flattened against the glass, dark, hollow eyes, staring in. They were pale figures, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins, teeth jagged and sharp. Shadows wove around them, twisting their forms in impossible ways. I stumbled backward into the corner of the room, breathing heavily. The figures seemed to breathe in sync with me, their whispers and screams feeding into the room's atmosphere. The air grew colder, heavier. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. The figures disappeared. Everything was still again. Only my ragged breathing broke the silence. I turned slowly, expecting them to reappear at any moment, but the windows and walls were empty. I woke my friends one by one, each of them groggy, disoriented. None of them remembered the events, or the whispers, or the figures. We couldn't explain what had happened, only that the air felt lighter now, as if the terror had vanished with the dawn. That night we locked the door and huddled together on the floor, too afraid to sleep again. When morning came, we packed up and left the woods behind, never looking back. It started as a simple road trip. My friends and I were traveling through a quiet countryside during the early fall season. The golden fields stretched endlessly, dotted with rows of pumpkins and scarecrows leaning ominously against the fading light. We stumbled upon a small village that was celebrating their annual harvest festival. The village itself seemed out of time, a place untouched by modern life. The streets were cobbled, and the houses were weathered but charming. The festival was lively, with people gathered around bonfires, eating traditional foods, and children laughing as they ran through fields filled with hay bales and carved jack-o'-lanterns. It all seemed pleasant at first, but something felt off. The locals were welcoming, but there was a strange sense of unease in the air. Their smiles never quite reached their eyes, and their conversations often veered into hushed tones as soon as we approached. Every attempt to join the festivities felt like an intrusion, like we were being watched from the corners of their minds. That evening, we attended a ceremony in the center of the village, a ritual where an elder, draped in crimson robes, raised his hands to the darkening sky. The townspeople chanted strange, unfamiliar words in unison, their voices rising in harmony. It sounded almost beautiful, but it made my skin crawl. After the ceremony, we wandered off the main square to explore the village's outskirts, hoping to escape the unsettling atmosphere. We found a field on the edge of town, a massive expanse of twisted crops with scarecrows dotting the landscape like silent sentinels. As we wandered deeper into the field, the laughter from the festival faded, replaced by silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence. "That's enough," Jess said, her voice tense. "Let's head back." But just as we turned to leave, the scarecrows shifted. Their straw-filled bodies twisted unnaturally, moving as if pulled by unseen strings. Their hollow faces stared at us, and a low hum began to rise, a sound that made our heads throb with pain. "Run!" Brian screamed, grabbing Jess's hand as the scarecrows advanced toward us, their limbs jerking erratically. They moved like marionettes, unnatural and relentless. We bolted through the fields, our feet crunching against the dry soil. The scarecrows were faster than they should have been, their movements fluid despite their inhuman forms. One of them reached out, its hollow wooden hand brushing against my arm. It was cold, too cold, like ice pressed against flesh. "Get away!" I yelled, shoving it away. We stumbled onto a road at the village's edge, a thin trail leading into the woods. Behind us, the scarecrows stood still once more, their twisted forms frozen in place. But we knew better than to think they were done. We didn't stop running until we were far beyond the fields, the village and its twisted festival far behind us. Even then, the haunting echoes of the chants followed us, chilled whispers that crept into our dreams, waking nightmares that refused to be forgotten. It was late fall when we stumbled upon the old orchard. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The once lush fruit had long since rotted away, leaving nothing but skeletal remnants on the branches. We were driving through the countryside, searching for a quiet place to camp for the night. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the desolate orchard, and we couldn't resist the curiosity pulling us toward it. The air was colder than it should have been. As we walked through the uneven ground, the grass crunched beneath, our boots dry and brittle. The silence was unsettling. No chirping birds, no rustling of leaves, only the distant, oppressive stillness. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I mean, we're here now," Liam said with a nervous laugh. "Might as well explore a bit." The path we followed was barely discernible, marked only by patches of flattened grass where other visitors may have ventured years ago. Each step deeper into the orchard felt heavier, as if the weight of the place itself was pressing down on us. We came upon a grove of ancient apple trees with twisted roots creeping from the ground like veins. The fruit they bore had long since rotted away, leaving blackened husks hanging from the branches like decayed skulls. Even the slightest breeze seemed to hum through the trees, almost whispering unintelligible words. "Let's head back," I said. "This feels wrong." Before we could turn, the faintest of sounds reached our ears, a quiet, shuffling noise like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. We froze. The orchard seemed to hold its breath as we strained to listen. The sound grew louder, inching closer, yet we saw nothing. "Hello?" Liam called out, his voice quivering. The shuffling stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. The air grew colder, the oppressive stillness thickening until it became suffocating. A faint mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around our ankles, and an unnatural chill seeped into our bones. Suddenly, the trees creaked. A low, guttural groan echoed through the orchard, like the tortured wails of something long dead. The blackened apples rustled as if something unseen was moving among them. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, panic evident in her voice. Figure emerged from the mist. A twisted, emaciated silhouette, its body contorted unnaturally. It had no face, only a dark void where its features should have been. Long, claw-like hands extended toward us, each finger twitching with jerky, unnatural movements. We turned to run, but the ground beneath our feet became slick with mud, dragging us down. The figure closed in, its breath a cold whisper against our skin, its claws swiping the air as if searching for a hold. "Wake up!" Liam shouted, breaking free from the mud with sheer determination. The mist lifted, and the figure vanished just as suddenly as it appeared. We gasped for breath, falling onto the hard ground. The orchard was still, silent once more. But even after we left, the feeling lingered, an unsettling presence in the back of our minds, as if the orchard would never truly let us go. It was late in the evening when we turned off the main road. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a twilight that bled into deep shadows. We had been driving for hours, taking a shortcut through the countryside to get home faster. The GPS had insisted on this route, but as the miles passed, the road grew narrower, winding through dense woods on either side. "What did I tell you about shortcuts?" Samantha whispered, her voice tense. "It's fine," I reassured her. "It's just a back road. There's nothing out here." The car's headlights barely cut through the darkness, casting eerie patterns on the trees that loomed over the road. Every turn felt tighter, the air inside the car growing heavier with every mile. The silence was oppressive, only the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as we drove by. "Are we even still on the map?" Daniel asked nervously. "I don't know," I replied, checking the GPS once again. The signal was weak, flickering in and out of service, leaving us with nothing but static. The little blue dot on the screen moved erratically, as if the roads were shifting beneath us. Then, something made me stop the car. I had seen a figure standing by the roadside, just for a second. Tall and shadowy, it seemed to be watching us, as we drove by. By the time I pointed it out, it had vanished completely into the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What?" Samantha asked, eyes scanning the darkness. "Back there, by the road," I said, my pulse quickening. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," Daniel suggested, though his own hands were trembling as he checked the rearview mirror. But as we drove on, the sensation of being followed intensified. Every so often, we'd see movement at the edge of the trees, something dark and unnatural, shifting just out of sight. It was like a shadow, except it didn't quite move like anything human. "Can we just turn back?" Samantha pleaded. "There's nothing back there but trees," I said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Another mile passed in oppressive silence. Then the car sputtered, the engine cutting out. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the headlights flickering. "Oh, no," I murmured, trying to restart the engine. "It wouldn't turn over." "Of course," Daniel groaned. "Of course we break down out here." The woods around us felt heavier now, pressing in from all sides. The air felt colder, the silence deeper. We tried to keep the windows up, but the sound of something moving outside the car made us freeze. "Do you hear that?" Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. At first, we thought it was just more rustling in the trees. But then came the soft thud, like footsteps, moving toward us. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right beside the driver's door, just out of sight. I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my chest, and I glanced at the others. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. "Please," Samantha whispered, "just start the car." I turned the key again, and the engine roared to life. The headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, taller than any human, with elongated limbs and no distinct features, just a dark silhouette against the forest. The shape didn't move, didn't blink or react. It just stood there, watching us with hollow, inky voids where its eyes should have been. "Drive," Daniel yelled. I floored the accelerator, tires spinning on the dirt. We tore down the road, the figure still standing behind us in the rearview mirror. No matter how fast we went, it kept pace, never disappearing. Completely. After what felt like hours, we broke through into a clearing, and the figure finally vanished. The woods fell away, replaced by the smooth asphalt of the main road. We drove until we saw signs of civilization, gas stations, streetlights, and didn't stop until we were safely in the middle of the next town. None of us spoke. The shadow still lingers in the back of our minds, an unseen, unexplainable terror that defied logic and reason. It was the kind of evening where the air felt heavy, pressing down on you as if the weight of the forest itself was watching. My friends and I had taken a spontaneous trip to the woods, a place we had only vaguely heard about, deep within the Kew Mountains. The sun had already set, and the shadows were stretching across the path we had chosen, consumed by darkness. The trail had become narrow, winding between towering pines that seemed to close in around us, their twisted roots clawing through the soil. We were supposed to meet at a secluded campsite, but the deeper we went, the more the sense of isolation set in. There was no cell service, no sign of life, and the quiet of the forest had turned unnerving. At first, it was subtle, whispers, faint and distant, curling through the trees. We dismissed them as the wind at first, but as the night grew darker, the sounds became clearer. "Leave! Leave! You shouldn't be here!" They were hollow, breathy voices that seemed to come from every direction, wrapped in an unnatural echo. "Guys," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" "Stop being so paranoid," Kate said, though her voice wavered as she glanced around nervously. But I knew they weren't just hearing things. The whispers grew louder with every step. They followed us through the trees, intertwining with the rustling of leaves, wrapping around us like a cold fog. Every once in a while we'd hear a voice that wasn't quite human, a guttural growl, low and menacing, just beyond the edge of hearing. As we trudged forward, the path became thinner, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding undergrowth. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy, and our flashlights only created fleeting, flickering circles of light that seemed to do little against the suffocating darkness. "Let's turn back," I suggested, my voice strained. "This isn't right." But something in the air didn't allow us to simply turn around. The forest seemed to pull us deeper, unwilling to let go of its prey. Shadows darted between the trees, swift and silent, always watching us. Each breath we took felt heavier, as though the very air was suffocating. We found an old, crumbling stone structure along the path, a forgotten ruin, half hidden by vines and overgrowth. None of us remembered it from the map we had been given. We hesitated at the entrance, the whispers thick around us. The air inside the ruin was colder, unnaturally so, and it smelled of decay. Suddenly, the voice came again, loud and clear. "You've gone too far." Where's that coming from?" Kate stammered, panic washing over her face. a figure stepped into the glow of my flashlight. Tall, gaunt, and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The creature, or whatever it was, wore tattered robes that flowed unnaturally as if carried by an unseen wind. It didn't move like a person. It moved like something else entirely, something ancient and otherworldly. The whispers turned into screams. The air grew colder, unbearable. Kate screamed, trying to push past the others, but the figure was already upon us. It reached out with long, bony fingers brushing against Sam's face, leaving behind a chill that froze his scream in place. I forced my legs to move, shoving everyone back through the narrow entrance of the ruin. The whispers became unbearable, a cacophony of voices all screaming for us to leave. We ran blindly through the woods, the trees seeming to stretch their branches toward us, trying to ensnare us in their roots. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst free onto the forest edge, gasping for air. The oppressive darkness receded, and we stumbled down the path away from the nightmare. The screams faded behind us, lost in the distance, but the terror lingered, etched into our bones. We never went back. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend getaway into the woods with a few close friends. We had picked a spot deep within the forest, away from any trails or other campers. The air was fresh, the trees towering over us in a seemingly endless sea of green. But something felt off. We set up camp near the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. The chirping of crickets was replaced by a heavy silence that hung like a shroud over the woods. "It's too quiet," James said, his voice hushed. He was right. Normally, the forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant howls of animals, even the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But here, it was unnaturally still. That night, after dinner and a small fire, we sat around in a circle, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but even that didn't push away the creeping sense of unease. We kept hearing soft whispers from beyond the tree line, whispers that seemed to call our names faintly, carried by the wind. Each time someone mentioned it, another would brush it off, saying it was probably just an animal or the wind playing tricks. But as the night deepened, those whispers grew more distinct. Voices murmuring things we couldn't quite understand. The air became heavier, colder. Each gust of wind brought with it a sense of being watched. I felt like something, or someone, was standing just beyond the firelight, just out of reach. Around midnight, we decided to turn in for the night. The moon hung low, casting eerie beams through the gaps in the trees. I zipped up my tent and lay down, my ears straining for any sounds. Outside, the forest was alive again, but with something far more sinister. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush just outside my tent. My breath hitched as I froze, my heartbeat loud in my ears. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. These were human steps. "Guys," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," Emily responded sleepily. "There's something out there," I said, my voice trembling. "I can hear footsteps." "Don't freak out," she replied. "It's probably just an animal or another camper." But as the minutes passed, the footsteps didn't fade. They grew closer, closer to my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath whatever was walking, soft and measured. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Matt?" James's voice came through the darkness. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I whispered urgently. "Something is—" Before I could finish, the footsteps stopped. There was a long silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves. And then, softly like a breath against my ear, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I yanked the tent flap open, screaming into the darkness. The others rushed out of their tents, all eyes wide with fear. but the forest was empty. Nothing but trees swaying gently in the breeze. "What the hell was that?" Emily gasped, clutching James's arm tightly. "I don't know," I said, my voice still trembling. "It was right there. I heard it." We couldn't sleep after that. The whispers followed us even as we sat by the fire, their voices seeming to come from every direction. The night stretched on forever, and each second that passed felt heavier, more oppressive. As dawn broke, the woods returned to their usual state, quiet, serene. But none of us spoke much on the drive back. The memory of those whispers, the feeling of being hunted, refused to leave. It was a late afternoon when my friends and I stumbled upon the meadow. We had been driving through the countryside, seeking a quiet place to camp for the night. The sun was setting behind a thick veil of clouds, casting the landscape in shades of gray and gold. Off the beaten path, we found a small dirt road leading into an overgrown field, a place we assumed no one had visited in years. The meadow was expansive, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. Wildflowers bloomed sporadically, their colors, dull and faded, blending into the tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. It felt peaceful at first, almost serene, but something didn't sit right. As we set up camp near the center, the silence pressed in on us. The occasional rustling of leaves from the distant woods was the only sound, but it seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. The air was thick, heavy, and somehow cold, even though the temperature was warm for late summer. "Let's get the fire going," Alex suggested, trying to break the tension. His voice echoed softly into the stillness. We gathered wood and started, building a small blaze, but it flickered unnaturally, as though hesitant to light. Shadows danced along the edges, moving more than the fire itself. That's when we heard it. A soft, indistinct whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, just the faintest murmur, like the rustling of breath behind us. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked quietly, lowering her voice as if speaking louder would draw attention. "Hear what?" I replied, though I already knew. The whisper had been real. We fell into an uneasy silence, our focus shifting between the fire and the darkening woods. The whispers continued, though now they felt closer, more distinct. They shifted from incomprehensible murmurs to something almost human, faint voices speaking, laughing, though they never formed clear words. Suddenly, the fire went out. The embers sank into ash as if extinguished by an unseen force. We sat in total darkness. The only sound, the steady rustling of grass, louder now, more invasive. "Something's not right," Alex murmured, his voice trembling. "That's putting it lightly," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Shadows slithering across the perimeter of the firelight, shifting just out of reach. They weren't animals. No creature moved like that. No natural form bent and twisted in such unnatural ways. "Stay close," Sam whispered, her voice trembling. "Just stay close." The whispers became louder, clearer. They weren't just disembodied sounds anymore. They spoke to us now, voices overlapping and rising in volume. "Leave, leave, leave," they chanted, echoing from the woods and around the edges of the meadow. Panic set in. We gathered our things hastily, bumping into one another in the dark. The once familiar world seemed foreign, twisted in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, forming a crescendo, an endless, maddening symphony of voices all around us. We bolted toward the car, our feet pounding on the uneven ground. Behind us, the meadow disappeared into a void, the whispers swallowing everything. When we reached the car, the door slammed shut on its own, locking us inside. Breathless, we sat in the confined space, staring through the windshield into the nothingness beyond. The field had vanished, just an empty void stretched in its place. The whispers subsided, leaving only the silence once again. but we could still feel them, lingering, crawling beneath our skin. We left the meadow behind, driving into the darkness, but the whispers never left our minds. It started as a simple hike. My friends and I had planned a weekend trip into the woods, away from the city's noise and chaos. We found a quiet trail deep in the heart of the forest. No cell service, no signs of civilization for miles. The air was fresh, the trees towering around us like silent sentinels. The first few hours were peaceful. We snapped photos, laughed, and enjoyed the serene surroundings. But as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The forest felt older, darker. The chatter among us grew quieter, the smiles fading. The trail began to twist and turn, and the further we went, the less we recognized where we were. Every familiar marker, a fallen log, a stream we crossed earlier, had vanished. We were lost. Should we turn back? Jess asked, her voice uncertain. No, Ryan said confidently. Let's find a clearing and set up camp there. We can figure it out in the morning. The sun disappeared completely, plunging the forest into near-complete darkness. We lit a small campfire, its flickering light barely piercing the encroaching shadows. The sounds of the forest grew louder, whispers in the breeze, distant thuds of something moving through the underbrush. Every small noise made us jump. Stop messing around, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But even I could hear how uneasy I sounded. We're not alone, Ryan admitted softly. He stood up, scanning the surrounding trees. There's something out there. We huddled closer to the fire, whispering in hushed tones. The cold seemed to seep into the very air, pressing down on us. The flickering flames cast strange, shifting shadows, and from time to time we could see shapes. Dark, fleeting figures, just beyond the light's reach. Suddenly, a voice broke through the night, a soft, echoing hum. It wasn't words exactly, but a haunting melody, weaving through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. My breath hitched, and I glanced around, my heart pounding. Stop it, Ryan said, though his voice trembled as well. The melody grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just in our ears now. It seemed to come from everywhere, the air vibrating with the unnatural tune. The shadows around the fire flickered wildly, shifting into grotesque forms, limbs too long, faces contorted in agony. I could hear, breathing too, soft, hollow, almost like whispers being exhaled into the night. We need to leave, Jess said in a panic. Now. We tried to pack our things, moving as quickly as possible, but the sounds became overwhelming. Footsteps echoed in the distance, circling around us. I couldn't tell if they were real or imagined, but every time I glanced up, the figures in the shadows seemed closer, lurking just beyond the firelight. Finally, in a desperate rush, we ran, carrying only what we could in our arms. The melody followed us, growing louder and more distorted the further we fled. The forest seemed to stretch forever, the path twisting back upon itself as if we were trapped in some nightmarish loop. As we broke through the edge of the woods, gasping for air, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent once again, save for our ragged breathing. We turned back, too scared to venture deeper, and found our way to the road. The next morning, we returned with daylight, searching for the camp we had set the night before. But the clearing was gone. The fire pit was empty, the tent poles bent and broken, buried under a thick layer of dead leaves. Whatever had been with us in the dark was gone, but none of us would ever forget the night the forest tried to take us. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a weekend retreat at a secluded cabin perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. My friends and I drove through winding, desolate roads for hours before finally reaching the edge of the cliffs. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of salt water, and the view was breathtaking. Yet something felt off. The cabin itself was old, wooden and weathered, surrounded by towering evergreens that seemed to press in on it. Inside, the floorboards creaked loudly under our steps, and the dim, flickering lanterns added to the unsettling atmosphere. The ocean could be seen through the large windows, vast and dark, stretching endlessly to the horizon. That first evening, we settled in comfortably. We built a fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. It was peaceful for the most part, but the longer we stayed, the more we noticed things weren't right. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, shifting shapes that flickered whenever the firelight dimmed. Whispers could be heard when no one was speaking, and the faint sound of footsteps would echo through the cabin when the house was otherwise silent. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered nervously after dinner. Her voice was barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Hear what?" I asked, though I felt it too. A presence, something intangible, lingering beyond our sight. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the cabin with each gust. It sounded unnatural, almost like it was trying to get in. My friends lay sound asleep, oblivious to the discomfort I felt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Around midnight I sat up, staring at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could still see the faint silhouette of something moving beyond them. A figure, human-shaped but blurred, with no discernible features. It pressed its face against the glass, its dark eyes peering into mine, and then it was gone. A gasp escaped my lips as I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. The next morning, we explored the cabin and the surrounding cliffs in daylight, convincing ourselves that everything from the night before was just our imagination. Yet, the unease didn't leave. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, the air heavier. We tried to laugh it off, attributing it to the isolation of the place, but something inside told me we weren't alone. That night, things escalated. We heard footsteps again, soft, deliberate, pacing, in the hallway outside our rooms. They circled the cabin, sometimes stopping at a window, sometimes just beyond the walls. Whatever was out there seemed to be watching us, waiting. Suddenly, the power went out. Darkness consumed the cabin. Even the fire had burned low, its embers flickering feebly in the hearth. We sat in complete silence, clutching each other in the pitch-black room. The whispers began again, louder this time, more distinct, as if they were calling us. Not just whispers, but guttural murmurs, rising into an incomprehensible chant. I reached for my phone, hoping for light or a signal, but it was useless. The signal was gone, no bars, no connection. We were isolated, completely at the mercy of whatever force was in that cabin. In that moment, the figure returned, pressing against the glass once more, staring inside with those dark, empty eyes. It wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It moved slowly, deliberately, its shadow seeping under the door frame. "I can't breathe," Sarah whispered, gasping as she clutched her chest. "It's in here." The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices now filling the cabin, rising into a deafening crescendo. I could feel their hands reaching for us, clawing at the air, pulling us into darkness. When the sun rose again, we were alone. The cabin was silent. No sign of the figure. No more whispers. Only the faint echoes of a night we would never forget. It was a rainy evening when the bus dropped me off at the last stop. I was the only passenger, and the town seemed desolate in the fading light. The rain had picked up, drenching the empty streets in glistening reflections. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing, just the sound of the rain on the pavement. The bus rumbled away, leaving me alone at the stop. The old metal shelter creaked in the wind, the rusted roof sagging slightly. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote this place was. The nearest town was miles away. and I had no idea how I would get back once night fully set in. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked up and saw the streetlights flicker, dimming to a dull glow. I turned back to the shelter, seeking shelter from the relentless rain. That's when I heard it. A soft, hollow tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the rain. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like something was tapping against the glass of the bus shelter. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Nobody else was there. The tapping continued. My heart pounded harder, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones. I stepped back from the shelter, my gaze darting to the surrounding streets. There was nothing but darkness, no cars, no distant lights, no movement. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A breath escaped my lips as I exhaled a shaky sigh. I tried to convince myself it had been the rain or my imagination. But then the faint sound returned. Not on the glass this time, but from inside the shelter itself. It wasn't tapping. It was breathing. A low, rasping inhale echoed softly in the confined space. My breath hitched and I backed away, my back hitting the cold metal wall. My legs felt frozen, and panic began to surge through me. The shelter seemed to close in around me, the shadows shifting unnaturally, stretching toward me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. Just the rhythmic breathing, steady, uneven. The rain pounded louder now, filling the air with a steady roar, but beneath it, I could still hear the breath. Suddenly, the flickering streetlights shut off, completely, plunging the stop into complete darkness. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands. The breathing stopped. A terrifying stillness fell over me. Then I heard a voice, a faint, distorted whisper so close to my ear that I could feel its chill. "Why did you stay?" The question reverberated through my skull, deep and echoing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Panic surged through my body as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A single drop of rain fell onto my cheek, cold and wet. And then another, and another, until the entire world felt like it was drowning in darkness. The shelter was gone, the bus stop lost to the void. It had been years since anyone had lived in the grand old estate. The once stately mansion sat at the edge of a wooded hill, its windows dark and its gates rusted shut. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, whispers of the family who had vanished, without a trace decades ago. Curious, my friends and I decided to explore it. As we parked our car along the long winding driveway, the sun was setting fast. Shadows stretched across the lawn, and the silence was unsettling. No birds, no breeze. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. We approached the mansion cautiously, stepping over overgrown weeds and broken cobblestones. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of forgotten memories. Dust coated every surface and the scent of decay was overwhelming. Furniture had been pushed aside or torn apart, revealing splintered wood and faded fabrics. The grand chandelier above us hung precariously, its crystals cracked and reflecting warped shadows. "Be careful," I warned as we navigated the dark hallways, but the others were too mesmerized by the beauty of the place to heed my words. In the ballroom, the floorboards creaked beneath our feet, sounding louder than they should have. A broken mirror leaned against the far wall, reflecting an empty space where a figure shouldn't have been. Yet, when I glanced back, I swear I saw a distorted face, its eyes hollow and sunken, watching us from the reflection. I turned away quickly, dismissing it as a trick of the dim light. We continued deeper, searching for signs of anything left behind. At the far end of the hall, we stumbled upon a locked door, its wood old and warped with age. There was something unsettling about it, like the very air around it was heavier. As I touched the doorknob, a chill ran down my spine. Before I could turn it, a voice whispered from behind us. You shouldn't be here." We froze, turning slowly. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no breathing. Just the echo of the voice lingering in the oppressive silence. I reached for my flashlight, but it flickered weakly, only illuminating the darkness further. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The weight in the air pressed, heavier, a suffocating presence looming over us. "Let's get out," someone whispered. As we turned toward the main entrance, a sound echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if something impossibly tall was walking toward us. My heart pounded. The whispers grew louder again, no longer a voice, but a chorus of whispers, filling the room with ancient, inhuman murmurs. We bolted for the door, but it was locked. Panic set in. The whispers rose into guttural chants, filling the space with something dark, something long forgotten. Finally, with one final scream, the door burst open, revealing nothing but empty moonlight. The estate stood behind us, silent once more. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. The mansion was gone by the time we glanced over our shoulders. It was just a normal evening. Cool air, the distant hum of cars on the street. I left the office late, the city lights dimming as I walked down an empty alley toward my apartment. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The usual buzz of nightlife had faded, leaving nothing but silence. As I approached the end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows. They stood still, watching me. My heart quickened, but I tried to stay calm. There was something unnatural about their stance. Still too deliberate. They wore a long, dark coat, and the face beneath the hood was hidden in shadow. "Hey," I said cautiously, slowing my pace. "Are you lost?" No answer. The figure took a slow step forward. Another. I started to back away, but my foot hit something sharp in the dirt. I looked down. It was a pocket mirror, cracked and stained with dirt. My breath caught. There was something inside the glass, something twisted, grotesque, and it wasn't my reflection. Panic surged through me. I spun around to run, but the figure was there again, impossibly close. Their voice was a low whisper, distorted, like it came from miles away. "You shouldn't have looked." The darkness around us seemed to press in, swallowing the streetlight. Glow. I stumbled, backing toward the alley wall. The figure stepped even closer. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. Then the air shifted, a chill so cold it felt like a knife to my skin. The sound of whispers filled the alley. Dozens of voices, millions of voices, echoing in unison. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body rigid with fear. The figure raised their hand, and from beneath the hood, a mouthless face emerged. A void, nothing more than darkness. They opened it, and the whispers intensified. I couldn't hear anything else. No traffic, no distant noise, just that suffocating, oppressive silence. "Don't look away," the voice said again. This time it was inside my mind, but I couldn't. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I tried to push forward. The figure, the void, was the only thing I could see, pulling me into the depths of that unholy darkness. And then it all went black. Last winter, my friends and I rented a remote lodge in the mountains. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just snowboarding, hot cocoa, and the crackling warmth of a fireplace. The lodge was nestled deep in the forest, far from any other people, and the snowstorm that hit on the first night made sure we were completely cut off. The place was massive, 3 stories tall with creaky wooden floors, dark hallways, and antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first night was cozy. We sat by the fire, played board games, and told ghost stories. But as the storm raged outside, something started to feel wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming, on a window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch hitting the glass in the wind. But when I checked, there was no branch, and the window was perfectly still. The next morning, my friend Claire said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway during the night. They were slow, like someone was pacing, she said, laughing nervously. We joked about the lodge being haunted, but her unease stuck with me. That evening, the power went out. It wasn't surprising, given the storm, but the timing felt off. The fireplace was still roaring, so we gathered around it, using flashlights and lanterns to light the room. The howling wind outside made the old house groan and creak like it was alive. While we sat there, we heard a loud thud upstairs. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was deliberate, like something heavy had been dropped. We all froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" Ethan whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep everyone calm. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Another sound followed, this one sharper, a dragging noise like furniture being pulled across the floor. It came from the third floor, the part of the house we hadn't explored yet. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the third floor. The air was colder up there, and the hallways felt narrower, the shadows darker. We checked every room, old bedrooms, storage spaces, but they were all empty. Finally, we reached the last door, at the very end of the hall. It was locked. "Let's just go back downstairs," Claire pleaded, but Ethan was already fiddling with the doorknob. With a loud snap, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor, around the chair, were deep scratches, as if it had been dragged back and forth for years. The air smelled foul, like rotting wood and mildew. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked and dusty. As we stepped inside, our flashlight beams bounced off the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the reflection, something that wasn't us. "Do you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. We stared at the mirror. The room behind us was empty, but in the reflection there was a figure sitting in the chair. It was pale, hunched, and facing away from us. Ethan shone his flashlight directly at the chair. It was empty. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, like it had been slammed by an unseen hand. The mirror's reflection shifted. The figure stood up, slowly turning to face us. Its face was blank, featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming. It stepped closer in the reflection, though nothing moved in the room. Then the glass shattered. We screamed, bolting for the door. It wouldn't budge. The air grew icy and the walls seemed to close in. Behind us, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. Soft. At first, then heavier, faster, coming straight toward us. Just as the door finally gave way, the room plunged into silence. We stumbled back down the stairs, hearts racing. No one spoke for the rest of the night, and we left the lodge the moment the storm cleared. I don't know what we saw in that mirror, or why it was there. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint sound of a chair dragging across the floor. The snow fell heavy and fast as we made our way up the winding mountain road. My friends and I had rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, a place untouched by modern life, surrounded by towering pines and endless white. The sun had already set, leaving the landscape bathed in an eerie, blue-tinted glow. As we arrived, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snow into violent gusts that obscured the path behind us. The cabin stood alone, a weathered wooden structure that creaked with each blast of wind. There was no signal, no power, just silence and isolation. Inside, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and we settled in. We laughed, unpacking supplies and sharing stories of the strange legends surrounding the cabin. Locals had warned us to stay alert. Strange things happen in those woods, they said. Of course, we dismissed them as just old tales meant to. Scare tourists. That night, as the storm raged outside, something woke me. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe the howling wind or the sudden stillness that followed. I sat up, the room dimly lit by the flickering fire. My friends slept soundly, their breathing even and steady. But something wasn't right. A faint tapping echoed through the cabin, soft, rhythmic, like fingers against a window pane. It wasn't the wind. It came from the front door. I froze. My pulse quickened. The storm outside drowned any sound of movement, but the tapping grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was there, was trying to get in. I slowly reached for my phone, hoping for a signal, but it was dead. I could hear nothing but the storm. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stood frozen, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence again, except for the distant creaks of the cabin settling into the storm's embrace. Then, a voice, low and distorted, whispered, "My name." It was close, too close. I backed away from the door, heart racing. My mind screamed to wake the others, but fear kept me rooted. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The door handle began to turn slowly, not enough to fully open, but enough that I could hear the faint scrape of metal against wood. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." "No," I whispered back, shaking. I stumbled back to the corner of the room, too terrified to move. Outside, the storm raged on, but the tapping grew frantic. The whispers morphed into quiet, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from within the very walls of the cabin. They seemed to echo inside my head, louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the power flickered on briefly, just for a second, but long enough for me to see. The figure. It stood just beyond the window, half obscured by the falling snow. Its face was hollow. No features, just an inky void where a face should be. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, pale and cold. The scream ripped from my throat as the fire went out, plunging us into darkness once more. I could hear the others stirring, confused, but the figure was already inside, its voice closer now, a sinister whisper in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." It was a strange dare to begin with. Spend one night in the abandoned watch factory on the edge of town. The place had been shut down decades ago after a fire gutted most of the interior, leaving it a hollow shell of its former self. Locals avoided it, claiming the place was cursed, but I never believed in that kind of thing, and I wasn't about to back out in front of my friends. The factory loomed in the moonlight, its towering smokestacks reaching into the night sky. Broken windows stared down at me like empty eyes, and the faint smell of soot still lingered, even after all these years. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I stepped inside. The air inside was colder than I expected, heavy and still. My footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous space as I wandered through rows of rusted machinery. Pieces of old watches lay scattered across the floor, tiny gears, broken faces, cracked glass. The walls were scorched black in places, and the ceiling above was an intricate lattice of exposed beams and metal. I aimed my flashlight at an old clock mounted on the far wall. It was frozen in time. The hands stuck at precisely 2:17. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned away, heading deeper into the factory. As I explored, strange things began to happen. First, it was the sounds, soft metallic clicks, like gears turning, echoing through the empty space. Then, faint whispers, too distant to make out but unmistakably human. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, scanning the room with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sound echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I pressed on, trying to ignore the rising dread. In one corner of the factory, I found a small office, its door hanging off the hinges. Inside, a desk sat covered in dust, an old ledger open to a page filled with unreadable scribbles. On the wall behind the desk was another clock, identical to the one I'd seen earlier. Its hands were also frozen at 2:17. I took a step back, the hair on my neck standing on end. That was when I heard it, a faint ticking sound, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the office, but from somewhere deeper in the factory. The sound pulled me forward, almost against my will. As I moved closer, the ticking grew faster, more frantic. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam cutting in and out. I stumbled into a large, open room, my eyes widening at what I saw. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, each one different in shape and size. Some were ancient, their faces worn and cracked, while others looked pristine, untouched by time. But they all had one thing in common. Their hands were frozen at 2:17. The ticking sound surrounded me now, deafening, though none of the clocks were moving. My flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, its weak glow the only light left. Then I saw it. Something moving between the clocks. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with jerky mechanical precision, its head swiveling toward me. Two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been fixed on me, unblinking. The figure stepped closer, its movements accompanied by the sound of grinding gears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as it reached out with a hand made of twisted metal. Suddenly, all the clocks in the room began to chime at once, their discordant tones echoing through the factory. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony that made my ears ring. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if listening. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The clocks stopped chiming. The room fell silent once more. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, tripping over debris, my phone's light bouncing wildly. When I finally burst out of the factory and into the cold night air, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The next day, I returned with my friends, determined to prove what I'd seen. But when we entered the factory, the clocks were gone. The walls were bare, and the room was empty. Only one thing remained, my flashlight lying on the floor where I'd dropped it, the beam still pointed at the wall, and etched into the scorched brick were the words, "Time belongs to us." It started a year ago. My best friend James invited me to join him on a hiking trip deep into an old forest. "No one's been there for years," he said, eyes lighting up with excitement. I hesitated at first. Forests have their share of eerie stories, but curiosity got the better of me. The hike began as expected. The woods were dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. James led the way, his compass guiding us through twists and turns, deeper and deeper into the trees. We left our phones behind, eager to disconnect. The silence was almost unnatural, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. As we ventured further, James pulled out an old leather-bound journal. "Found this in the library," he said, flipping through its pages. "It's from someone who came here years ago. Apparently, they never came back." I raised an eyebrow, but he shrugged it off. "Just a story," he said. Still, something gnawed at me. The pages were filled with strange sketches, trees contorted in unnatural ways, twisted faces peeking from behind them, whispers inked between lines. That's when things started to feel off. The air grew colder, though we were deep into summer. Shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering between trees even when no breeze stirred. James's voice sounded far away when he spoke, his words swallowed by the unnatural stillness. We set up camp by a small stagnant pond. James lit a fire, the flames crackling, casting flickering shadows on the trunks around us. The journal lay, open beside him, revealing more disturbing drawings. Creatures with hollow eyes, their twisted forms looming from the pages. "You okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. James didn't answer. He was fixated on the journal, flipping through the entries quickly as though desperate to find something. Suddenly, he froze. "There's a page missing," he whispered. "What?" I leaned closer, peering at the journal. Sure enough, one of the middle pages was torn out. It was clean, as if deliberately removed. "Someone didn't want us seeing what's there," James said, his voice uneven. "Look." He showed me the next page, completely blank except for a single word scrawled in jagged letters. "Run." We both stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Just then, the fire flickered out. The darkness pressed in around us. The pond behind us rippled unnaturally. The shadows moved faster now, circling our campsite. I could hear whispers, low and desperate, as though something was calling from the trees. James stumbled back from the journal, his face pale. "Something's here," he whispered. I turned in a frantic circle, searching for any glimpse of movement. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices now, but their words were incomprehensible. The trees seemed to stretch toward us, their branches clawing the air, creating an eerie dance of shadows. "We need to leave," I managed to say, my voice quivering. Suddenly, James's flashlight flickered weakly. He dropped it in horror as the darkness swallowed us whole. "I can't see," he choked out. His hands flailed as if reaching for something that wasn't there. I grabbed his arm and started running, the cold dirt beneath my feet desperate to escape. The journal lay forgotten by the fire, its pages fluttering wildly in an invisible wind. We sprinted through the woods, the sound of our own breathing deafening. The shadows stretched out before us, swallowing everything behind. The whispers became screams, and I couldn't tell if they were in my mind or all around us, but we kept running. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The forest fell silent. We stood there, breathless, the air eerily still. The fire was gone, the pond frozen over, the journal lying open where we had left it. The pages were back, no longer blank. But now the words were far darker. "You didn't listen. You never should have stayed. Now you're ours." James turned to me, his face pale as death. "We're not alone." I shook my head, unable to speak, as the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. From the corner of my eye, I saw the twisted trees bend toward us, their branches now reaching for us, horrifically alive. And in the distance, I heard a soft whisper, one I will never forget. "You can't leave." We had just moved into the old apartment building downtown. The place was cheap, secluded, and isolated from the rest of the city. The building itself looked like it hadn't seen anyone go in or out for years. Dust-covered windows, peeling paint, and the smell of mildew filled the air as we stepped through the front door. The landlord had warned us about some quirks, but we didn't think much of it. Our first night in the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel exposed. We didn't think much of the creaking sounds coming from the floors, or the occasional draft whispering through the cracks. The next night, though, something changed. It started with a knock. One soft, hollow knock at the front door. We froze. There were no visitors. Nobody had been inside the building for as long as we knew. Ryan, always the brave one, made his way to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing, just the empty hallway. "Maybe the wind," he muttered, half joking. We exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. That was until the knocking came again, this time louder. A relentless, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the old building. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. None of us wanted to move. We were rooted in place, our hearts racing. Every knock seemed to come from a different part of the apartment, sometimes from the door, sometimes from the walls, and other times from above us. The sounds grew closer, surrounding us, closing in as if whatever was making them was right, there in the room with us. That's when the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible. Then it grew louder, more distinct. "Let us in." The voice wasn't human, though it sounded like it had once been. The words were muffled, distorted, as if the speaker was trying to force them through some otherworldly filter. We couldn't understand what was happening, but the fear was overwhelming. Emma tried to move toward the window, hoping maybe there was someone outside, but as soon as she got close, the knocking intensified, the whispers growing louder. We could feel them inside our heads now. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, doors barricaded, hearts pounding. The knocking continued throughout the night, never ceasing, never fading. The whispers turned to screams, shrill and hollow, reverberating off the walls of the old building. It was as if the entire apartment had come alive, its very structure trying to consume us. Morning didn't bring relief. We opened the door to silence, the apartment exactly as we left it. No signs of intrusion, no footsteps, no broken locks. But the whispers, those echoes, never left us. They haunt us now, in every quiet moment. Whatever was with us that night didn't come from outside. It had been there all along, waiting, and it never truly left. It started with a simple invitation, a remote retreat in the mountains. My friend Sam had stumbled upon an old, secluded villa nestled high in the peaks. The idea was to escape the noise of the city, unwind in a place untouched by modern life. Sam had promised us peace, solitude, and breathtaking views. The villa was hidden away, accessible only via a winding, treacherous road that spiraled up the mountainside. When we finally reached the top, the place looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The grand structure was centuries old, its faded exterior barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. Large, ivy-covered windows glared like hollow eyes, watching as we approached. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The furniture was old and moth-eaten, and cobwebs clung to every corner. There were no modern amenities, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. It felt like we had stepped into a different era entirely. But we brushed it off, thinking of it as part of the charm. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. It was peaceful at first, but then something changed. We started hearing faint whispers, soft murmurs carried by the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from the hallways, from behind the closed doors. Each time we opened a door to investigate, there was nothing but emptiness. We joked that it was just the old house settling, but the whispering only grew louder. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But the next night, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't just murmurs. They were voices, muffled, distorted, like they were speaking a language we couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from every direction, sometimes whispering in unison, other times fragmented and disjointed. Sam went to bed early, exhausted. From the long drive, leaving me and Emma to stay up by the fire, we tried to ignore the unsettling sound, but it was impossible. The whispers filled the entire house, echoing through the hallways. I swear I could feel them breathing down my neck. Then, at some point, the whispers changed. They began speaking, my name. Soft, almost loving, the way someone might whisper to a child in the dark. I froze, the chill of fear racing up my spine. Emma heard it too, her face pale and trembling as she clung to my arm. We moved closer to each other, but the voices grew louder. Not just my name, but others. Names I didn't recognize. They seemed to be coming from the other side of a door, at the end of the hall, the only door that remained locked. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed endlessly until we couldn't ignore them anymore. Finally, driven by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I approached the door. My hand trembled as I placed it on the knob, turned it slowly, and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers came from below. They seemed to beckon us, urging us to follow. My legs felt frozen, but Emma grabbed my hand and tugged me forward. We couldn't fight the pull. As we descended, the air grew colder. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. I could now make out fragments. "Come to us," they whispered. "We've been waiting." At the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with portraits, faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us as we walked. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast, ancient hall. It was like something out of a nightmare. Rows of long wooden tables covered in rotting food and dust. At the far end, we saw figures seated in shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They didn't move, but the whispers seemed to come from them, filling the room like a chorus. The moment we stepped into the hall, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, suffocating. The figures remained seated, their heads bowed. We stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they raised their heads, their hollow eyes fixed on us. In that instant, I knew. The whispers had been them, waiting. The last thing I saw were those empty, lifeless eyes staring straight at me as we ran back up the stairs, the whispers echoing once more behind us. We made it out of the villa, but we didn't speak of what we saw. The memories haunt us still, the echoes of those whispers following us wherever we go. Something followed us from that place, something that remains in the shadows, waiting, always waiting. My cousin and I used to explore the fields behind our grandparents' old farmhouse every summer. The place was vast, with acres of corn and wheat, a rickety barn that seemed like it might collapse any day, and a patch of woods that everyone in the family avoided. Grandpa always said it wasn't safe. Snakes, sinkholes, or some vague story about trespassers, we never believed him. This summer, curiosity got the better of us. On a lazy afternoon, after Grandma fell asleep on the porch, we grabbed flashlights and decided to explore the woods. It wasn't a planned adventure, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The air was cooler under the canopy of trees, the thick smell of moss and earth surrounding us. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the farm disappeared. No wind rustling, the corn, no birds. It felt like stepping into another world. My cousin, always braver than me, joked about finding hidden treasure or an old cabin full of relics. We didn't find treasure. What we found was something else. About half a mile into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure, a stone well covered with moss and half crumbling, like it had been there for centuries. But what was odd wasn't the well itself. It was the carvings on the stones around it. Strange symbols and spirals, etched deep into the surface, uneven like they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. My cousin leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. I expected to see water or maybe just darkness. Instead, there was a dull shimmer, like something metallic reflecting light far below. He whispered something, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on one of the symbols on the well's rim, a crude, jagged spiral. It felt alive, almost pulsing under the flashlight beam. Then we heard it, a voice. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but something low and guttural, echoing faintly from deep inside the well. My cousin stumbled back, dropping his flashlight into the pit. The light flickered as it tumbled down, illuminating the sides of the well as it fell. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow curling along the stone. I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but he just stood there, staring at the well, his mouth slightly open. When I shook him, he finally snapped out of it, muttering, "Did you hear it? It said my name." I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to get out of there. I pulled him away, and we hurried back through the woods, tripping over roots and branches. The air felt heavier now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, we were both gasping for breath. We didn't tell anyone about the well. Not that day, not that summer. But things changed after that. My cousin started sleepwalking, which he'd never done before. He'd wake up outside, standing at the edge of the cornfield, always facing the woods. One night, he woke me up, standing by my bed with a blank expression, saying he needed to go back. I tried to convince him it was just a dream, that the well wasn't real, or, if it was, that it didn't mean anything. But he was adamant. He said it was calling him, that it wasn't finished with us. The last straw came on the final night of the summer. We were packing up to leave the farm when I heard the screen door slam. My cousin was gone. I ran outside, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Grandma and Grandpa were asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods. I found him in the clearing, standing next to the well. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the darkness. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and shined my flashlight into the well. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. The shimmer from before was gone. Instead, there was something climbing up the walls, something with too many limbs, its skin slick and glistening like oil. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a mass of sharp, twisting shapes. I screamed, pulling my cousin away. As we stumbled back, the well went silent again, and the clearing felt empty, lifeless. He finally looked at me, his face pale, and said, "It knows us now." We never spoke about it after that night. The woods were off limits for the rest of the summer, and the next year the farm was sold. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us, and I hear its voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably calling my name. It was the kind of summer evening where the air feels thick, almost suffocating. My friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned amusement park that was rumored to be haunted. The place had been closed for decades, forgotten, overgrown, and left to rot. We weren't really sure what we expected to find, but the idea of exploring something so eerie felt like the perfect escape from the humdrum of our usual lives. As we parked near the entrance, the silence was oppressive. The old, rusted gates groaned as we pushed them open, the metal scraping against itself. The ground was uneven beneath our feet, with weeds and tall grass creeping up through the cracks in the concrete. It felt as though time had stopped. We walked through the overgrown pathways, stepping carefully to avoid the broken glass and twisted remnants of rides that once filled this place with laughter. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its rusted frame creaking in the faint breeze. We weren't exactly sure what we were hoping to find, but the air was thick with a strange tension that made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper into the park, the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Shadows stretched long and distorted, casting unsettling shapes on the decaying attractions. The further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and wind seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of our own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Then came the first sign that something wasn't right. We came across the old carousel. The once bright-painted horses were now faded and covered in moss. We stopped in front of it, the air suddenly feeling colder. I could see my breath in the dim light. Something felt off. I had this overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. Noticed a strange figure standing by the far side of the carousel, just beyond the broken tracks. It was tall, too tall, with a gaunt, skeletal frame that seemed unnaturally elongated. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing us with its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." They turned, following my gaze. At first, they didn't see it, but when they did, they froze. The figure stood still, its hollow black eyes staring at us. There was no face, just a void where its features should have been. It didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice shaking. We turned to run, but as we did, there was a sudden, sharp sound behind us. The slow creak of the carousel. I dared to look back, and there it was, moving. The horses spun, but there was no sound, just the grotesque image of the figure standing there, watching us. We ran, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to get back to the car. The park seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around us. Every time I looked back, I could see the figure, always there, always watching. When we finally stumbled out onto the road, we didn't stop running until we reached town. The park faded, behind us, swallowed by darkness. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple day at the beach, the kind where the sun beats down, the sound of waves is constant, and nothing seems out of place. My friends and I decided to take a trip to a secluded beach we'd heard about, far from the crowded tourist spots. We packed coolers, sunscreen, and our usual beach gear, eager for some peace and quiet. The beach was vast, rocky, and stretched out for miles. It felt like we were the only ones there, which was exactly what we'd wanted. We spent the day lounging, swimming, and talking. The water was refreshing, the sand soft beneath our feet, and the sense of isolation only added to the charm of the place. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocks, we decided to stay a little longer, hoping to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm and thick, but something about the silence unsettled me. It wasn't just the absence of other people. There was something else, something in the atmosphere that felt wrong. As the sun disappeared, the sky turned a deep purple and the horizon shimmered with orange streaks. We were packing our things when one of my friends, Lisa, stopped and pointed toward the edge of the beach. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. We all turned. Standing at the far end of the beach, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, its outline blending with the shadows of the cliffs. At first, we thought it might be someone hiking the cliffs, but they weren't moving. They stood there, motionless, watching us. "Maybe it's someone camping," one of my other friends suggested. But there weren't any campsites around, just endless rocks and cliffs stretching into the distance. We watched for what felt like forever, but the figure didn't move. It was like a statue, unmoving and silent. A chill ran down my spine. The more we stared, the more I felt like it was staring back at us, like we were the ones being watched. Lisa started to take a step forward, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "We should check," she said softly. "Maybe it's just someone lost." I wanted to argue, to tell her to stay put, but the silence and stillness of the figure were too eerie. We followed her, our steps hesitant on the uneven rocks. The closer we got, the more details we could make out. It wasn't human. It didn't have a face, at least, not in the way we expected. Its head was hollow, like an empty mask, and its limbs were too long and thin, twisted at unnatural angles. "Let's get back," I urged, my voice shaking. But before we could turn, the figure began to move. Slowly, methodically, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Run!" I shouted, my fear overcoming me. But before any of us could, the figure had closed the distance between us. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, long and bony, and touched Lisa's shoulder. Her scream echoed across the empty beach, but it wasn't the scream of someone in terror. It was hollow, lifeless. I didn't stop running until I was far away, back at the edge of the beach, gasping for breath. My friends followed, but Lisa wasn't with them. I turned back once, but she was gone. That night, as we sat huddled in silence, I couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. The figure, whatever it was, had taken her. I knew we'd never find her again. And as I stared at the dark horizon, I knew that we weren't the only ones left watching. It was supposed to be just an ordinary evening trip, something to break the monotony of everyday life. My friends and I decided to take the old winding road through the countryside, a place none of us had visited before. The idea was simple: leave behind the city's noise and escape into the quiet, untouched beauty of nature. The drive was uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead, snaking between tall, overgrown fields that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and we were lost in conversation, laughing about everything and nothing. The GPS kept pointing us forward, leading us deeper into the unknown. But then the air changed. The atmosphere became thicker, heavier. The trees began to crowd the road, their branches meeting high above like twisted fingers. It felt like we were descending into a different world, one untouched by time. We came to a bend in the road, and that's when it happened. The car jolted, the engine sputtering as it suddenly lost power. I steered to the side, the tires crunching against the gravel. The road was empty, and there was nothing for miles except endless forest. We tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine made a low, guttural sound and then gave up entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "We'll walk to the nearest town," someone suggested, but none of us were sure where that even was. We decided to stay put, hoping someone would pass by and offer help. Our phones were useless, no signal, no bars. It grew darker, and soon the only light came from the dying glow of the car's headlights. We sat in silence, passing around a flashlight to keep the shadows at bay. The woods felt alive. Every creak and crack of the branches was magnified, as if something were watching us. I don't know how much time had passed when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, not from the direction of the forest, but behind us. We froze, holding our breath. The footsteps were slow, measured, like they didn't belong to anyone we knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the soft crunch of shoes on gravel. The sound got closer, and then, to my horror, we saw them. A group of figures walking toward us from the darkness. They didn't run, didn't seem scared or worried. They moved like shadows, their faces obscured by the night, their footsteps steady and unwavering. "Who are you?" someone whispered, but the figures didn't respond. They just kept coming. The flashlight's beam swept over them, revealing details that chilled us to the bone. They were wearing mismatched, tattered clothes, faces void of expression. Their eyes weren't hollow. There was nothing behind them at all. They weren't human, not anymore. Panic surged through us as they stopped, standing in a silent circle around the car. They didn't speak, didn't react to our screams. They just stared, as though they were waiting for something. We knew we couldn't run. There was no point in screaming. We could only sit and hope they would leave, but the longer they stood there, the more I realized they weren't going anywhere. Then, one of them, barely more than a shadow, stepped forward. It wasn't one of the figures we had seen before. This one was different. It was taller, thinner, its limbs stretched unnaturally. It moved with a jerky, unsettling gait, like it didn't quite fit in its own body. It stared at us with cold, black eyes, and for a moment, I swear, it smiled. Not a human smile, but something inhuman, sharp, toothless, and utterly devoid of life. Time seemed to stretch as we sat there, trapped in the gaze of those empty eyes. The air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head, away, unable to bear the sight. When I looked back, they were gone. The figures, the strange figure, they were all gone. The forest was silent again, the only sound being the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. We didn't stay. We didn't look back. We ran, screaming into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town and found help. I don't know what they were or where they came from. I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that some things should remain hidden, buried deep in the shadows of forgotten places. A friend suggested we drive out to the old factory, located deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for decades, they said, left to rot after the industry moved elsewhere. No one had been there in years, and the idea of exploring an eerie, forgotten space seemed too intriguing to resist. We set off early in the afternoon, 3 of us packed into an old sedan. The drive was long, winding through narrow, overgrown roads until we finally reached the outskirts of the factory. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time. Tall, weathered brick walls covered in ivy, windows shattered and empty. The once mighty structure loomed over us, silent and still. We parked the car, and as we approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The place felt abandoned, sure, but not empty. There was a palpable sense of something watching, something that had never truly left. Inside, the factory was a maze of metal and decay. Broken machinery stood rusted and still, large gears covered in dust. The air smelled stale, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the empty halls, shining our flashlights on walls covered in graffiti, peeling paint, and remnants of what once was. At first, there wasn't much to see, just shadows stretching across the floor, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above. But as we moved deeper into the building, things began to feel wrong. It wasn't the faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't fear in the usual sense. More like an overwhelming sense of presence, something watching, following us. We kept moving, dismissing the feeling as overactive imaginations, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We reached what had once been the main hall, a vast expanse of cracked tiles and broken machinery. At the far end, partially hidden by a stack of debris, was a staircase leading to what looked like the second floor. We made our way towards it, stepping carefully through the clutter of fallen pipes and rusted metal. That's when we heard it. A low, faint groan, like metal twisting under pressure. We froze. It wasn't coming from the floor above, it was below. My stomach sank as I realized it was coming from the basement. The noise was distant, almost mechanical, but it felt wrong. I was about to suggest we leave when one of my friends, Jason, walked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls as he climbed. The sound continued, growing louder now, as if whatever made it was approaching. "Come on," Jason called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The others followed Jason down the creaking staircase, leaving me behind, my nerves frayed. I clutched my flashlight tighter, scanning the space. The noise had grown deafening now. Something was down there, something heavy. When I reached the bottom, the scene before me made my breath catch. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old machinery and storage crates. But what stood out were the deep, claw-like scratches etched into the floor, running from one end to the other. It was like something had dragged itself across the concrete, leaving long, deep marks behind. I tried to tell myself it was just decay, but the noises had stopped. The silence was now deafening. We all stood there, staring at the marks, when one of my friends let out a gasp. I followed his gaze, and there, in the far corner of the basement, was something I'll never forget. A figure, a tall, pale figure with hollow eyes, barely discernible in the dim light. It was partially obscured by shadows, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked onto us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jason was already moving toward it. His flashlight illuminated the figure, and for a moment we all stood frozen, unable to look away. Suddenly, the figure spoke, not with words, but with a low, inhuman hum that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. It wasn't a voice so much as a presence, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "We need to leave," one of my friends finally said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We fled up the staircase, the sound of the figure's hum fading behind us. My legs felt like jelly as we burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the darkness of the forest. But there, standing at the edge of the factory, was the figure. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about it again. But I know what I saw that night wasn't something from this world. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. It was a quiet Sunday evening when I decided to take a drive through the old deserted countryside. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just the open road and the fading light of the sun dipping beneath the horizon. The trees lining. The road swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. I loved these kinds of trips, especially when everything felt so still. The world seemed smaller out here, as though it had been untouched by time. But as the sun set and the last bit of daylight faded, I began to feel that familiar unease creep in. The road was narrow, winding through endless fields on either side. Occasionally, a farmhouse would come into view, but they were all dark and lifeless. As the miles stretched on, I found myself longing for a sign of life, anything to break the silence. The radio was silent, no stations picking up, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. It was about halfway through my journey when I spotted something strange off to the side of the road, a figure standing by a mailbox completely still. At first, I thought maybe someone was waiting for a ride or walking, back from a long walk. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. I slowed my car, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, like a statue carved from stone. It wasn't, until I passed, that I realized something even more unsettling. There was no house behind it. No house. Just an empty field that stretched on forever. I instinctively glanced in my rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. I didn't stop to think about it too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I told myself it was the isolation, the quiet, making me paranoid. But as I drove further, the same sensation returned. It was like I wasn't alone. Every curve of the road, every shadow cast by the trees felt darker than it should. I couldn't shake the idea that someone, or something, was watching me. I reached for my phone again, hoping for even the slightest signal. Nothing. My stomach tightened as I clenched the steering wheel. The road felt endless, and with every passing mile, that growing sense of unease dug deeper into me. It wasn't until I rounded a bend that I saw it, a figure standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing against the pavement. My headlights illuminated it, and I could see the outline clearly. It wasn't human. The shape was tall, much taller than any person should be. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, long, and its head tilted at a strange angle. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road. My breath hitched, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. I knew I couldn't drive past it. I wasn't sure if I even could. My foot hovered over the brake, but the figure remained unmoving. It was as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I sat there, frozen, until the silence became deafening. The air felt heavy, almost as if the very space around me had grown colder. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I realized I couldn't look away. It was like I was in a trance, my mind screaming to do something, anything, but my body refused to respond. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take the tension any longer, the figure moved, not forward, but upward. Its limbs stretched even more, reaching far above the car. And then, as if sensing my panic, it began to turn its head, slowly, as if observing me with curiosity. Its eyes, if it had any, seemed to pierce through the windshield. The next few moments felt like they stretched on forever, but then I did something I've never done before. I floored the gas pedal. My car roared to life, and I sped past the figure, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it, still standing, still watching. But there was no fear on its face, just a quiet, hollow gaze as it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station much further down the road, where I finally managed to get a signal. I called my friends, my voice shaky as I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. How could they? Even now, I don't think I fully understand what I saw. But one thing is certain. I never drove through that part of the countryside again, and I doubt I ever will. It was supposed to be a simple day, just a quiet walk through the neighborhood. I lived in a suburban area, nothing unusual about it. I liked to take long walks after work to clear my head, the kind of walks where you don't think much about anything, just put one foot in front of the other, lost in your own thoughts. But that day, something felt off from the very beginning. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything. The streets were empty, no kids playing, no cars passing by. It was eerily quiet, but I figured everyone must have been inside, waiting out the weather. I didn't think much of it, just kept walking, letting my mind wander. It wasn't until I passed the old abandoned house at the end of the street that the feeling of unease really sank in. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember. Worn-down shutters, a porch that creaked with every gust of wind. I always avoided it, always felt like something wasn't right about it. But this time, something about the atmosphere pulled me closer. I slowed my pace, staring at the house. It looked different, almost as if it had been watching me. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement inside. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. As I took another step forward, I heard a sound, a soft whisper, too low to make out. My skin crawled. I stopped, trying to listen, but the world around me seemed unnaturally silent, almost as though the sound had been swallowed by the void. Then I saw it. A figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows, standing still. It was tall, obscured by the dim light, but there was something off about it. It wasn't a shadow. It felt more like a void, an absence of something rather than a presence. My breath caught as the figure tilted its head as if studying me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to peer directly into my soul. Seconds felt like hours. Then the figure turned and disappeared from the window. My legs felt like stone as I finally managed to take a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave. I stumbled away, never taking my eyes off the house. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, truly watched. The emptiness that had once filled the neighborhood now felt suffocating, like the world had become a void of silence and shadows. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. The thought of that figure still haunted me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to forget me. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical. It was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something. Anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again. The woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there. She was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. But the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that. And I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. Let me in. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural, wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friends' rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple. Take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal, too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water. We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. It was a quiet summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and soak in the stillness of the countryside. We left town with no real plan, winding down narrow back roads, passing the occasional farmhouse and letting the radio fill the silence. We ended up on an old, forgotten road, the kind with broken pavement and weeds pushing through cracks. It stretched on for miles, empty except for the occasional crows circling above. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a dull orange glow. We pulled over at a random spot where the trees opened up, leaving a stretch of land that felt completely isolated. The silence was heavier now, the kind that creeps into your chest, making it harder to breathe. We got out of the car, stretched, and walked a few feet to sit on the hood, staring out at the horizon. It felt perfect, peaceful, distant, far from the chaos of everything. But as the minutes stretched on, a strange sense of tension began to creep in. My friend Jess was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of wind through the grass, but then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, echoing sound. A voice, perhaps, or something that barely resembled one. It was hard to tell. The sound came and went, almost like breathing, but slower, heavier. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some far-off noise we couldn't identify. But it didn't sit right. There was something too deliberate about it, like it was aware of us. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. We relaxed a bit, laughed nervously, and chalked it up to our imagination. But as soon as we settled back into our thoughts, we heard it again. This time, it was closer, more distinct. A whisper, drawn out, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. We all leaned in, listening harder now. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the clearing, just beyond where we could see. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us. "Let's get back to the car," I said, standing up. My voice was shaky. The fear I felt wasn't like any I'd ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual. But as we turned to walk back, we heard it again. Closer this time, and clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was laughter. A low, hollow laughter, chilling in its emptiness. It didn't sound like any human laugh. It wasn't playful. It was wrong. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Our feet moved faster, scrambling back toward the car, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees. When we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors shut and locked them. I could barely see through the windshield, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The laughter didn't stop. It was all around us now, growing louder, closer. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just as I was about to start the engine, Jess screamed. I turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes empty and hollow, watching us from the edge of the woods. We didn't hesitate. The car roared to life, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the empty road. The figure remained behind, standing motionless as we drove away. But I could still hear the laughter, trailing off into the distance. Even now, I wonder what was out there that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some animal, something we couldn't understand. But the look in its eyes, empty and hollow, tells me otherwise. Whatever was there, whatever followed us, is still out there. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again. The figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at home, the kind of day when the world slows down and you finally have a chance to relax, the kind of day you take for granted, never expecting anything unusual to happen. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just a cramped place with thin walls and old wooden floors that creak underfoot. Most of my neighbors are long gone, or at least that's what it felt like. The quiet was almost deafening, only broken by the occasional car passing by on the distant road. That day, I decided to stay in and watch some old movies, something to distract me from the creeping sense of boredom. Around 3 p.m., I popped a DVD into the player and sank into the worn-out couch. The room was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a while, it was peaceful. I was lost in the flickering images on the screen when something made me glance toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street outside was still. No cars, no pedestrians. Just that unrelenting silence. But then, a faint movement caught my eye. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker at the edge of the glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A figure. It wasn't standing still. No, it was shifting, pacing. Something tall and thin, too thin. Its form seemed distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. The more I stared, the more I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human. I wasn't even sure it was real. My gut told me to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, unable to move, the figure growing clearer with each passing second. Its face, if it had one, was blank. Just an empty expanse where eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe, then it tilted its head toward me, as if it could sense my gaze. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, like it could see right through me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed by some invisible force. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, its fingers dragging against the glass. I could hear the faint scratch like nails on a chalkboard, but it wasn't loud. It was almost whispered. The sound reverberated in my head, filling the room with a sense of unbearable dread. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure moved closer to the window, its form bending, folding in strange, unnatural ways. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were studying me. The closer it got, the less it resembled anything human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Its head tilted even farther, as if inspecting me from afar. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my soul. It didn't blink, didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The silence in the room had become oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then it spoke, or rather, it didn't. I heard no words, no sound at all, but somehow I understood what it was saying. The message was clear. You can't escape. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The figure didn't need to speak. It wasn't just standing there, it had crossed over somehow, into my world. It knew I couldn't run. I could feel its presence in my very bones, a suffocating, malignant force that had no intention of leaving. I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The silence remained, but the sense of its presence lingered, like a breath on my neck. I never saw it again, but I know it's still there, waiting. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. Look. I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet, too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess, old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us. the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light. And still, I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw, or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there,